So a very good evening, everybody. Most welcome to all of you. Not a huge number of people in this meeting, so that's going to give us a great opportunity for quite an intensive conversation, and I'm quite looking forward to that. My name's Andrew Thinn. I'm chairman of the Scottish Land Commission, have been since it started, really. And I've got three others from the Land Commission with me. So before I go any further, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I should, however, just highlight for you the fact that this is being recorded so we can put it up on our YouTube channel later in case anyone wants to look at it. So if you don't want to be videoed, please turn off your camera. If you're in your pajamas or something, you might want to do that. However, let's introduce the people who are here. So that's David Adams. Why don't you kick off and just tell us a bit about yourself?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm David Adams. I'm Emeritus Professor in Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow. I've been on the board of the Land Commission since it started, which is some years ago now. My main interest is in housing, land development, brownfield regeneration, design, vacant and derelict land. And despite all those urban emphases, I actually myself now stay in the borders. So I'm to the south of Edinburgh now rather than to the west of Edinburgh. Thanks, Andrew.
David, thank you very much indeed. And the other David, for some reason I can't see your picture, but I know you're there, David.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. I'm David Stewart. I joined the Land Commission just 4 years ago. I work on policy, but like Professor Adams, really around housing, land reuse, also a little bit in rural housing. I'm the most recent report I've been involved in with some work with Scottish Futures Trust and Architecture and Design Scotland, looking at the opportunity to regenerate town centres and provide a chance for town centre living.
David, thanks very much. And the person who's really in charge here, and certainly is the one who's going to make this all work, is Nikki. So Nikki, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, my name is Nikki. I'm head of comms for the Land Commission, and you'll see me sort of in the background today, just sort of helping everything to run smoothly. I noticed we've just had a question in the chat about volume. It should be a setting on your device that you're accessing this meeting from, so please do just check that you've got that up as high as you can. I just want to check with everybody else that they can hear us okay. If anyone's got any other problems, please do just drop something into the chat.
Nikki, thanks. Penny, I'm sorry, I saw your hand up and I was going to ask you to come in, but I think everyone else can hear fine. So if you, yeah, if the volume is too low, there will be a volume button probably at the bottom right of your screen, and you can turn it up there. I think I probably can't help you more than that, really. Okay. Yeah, Penny, if it continues to be a problem, put something else into the chat, and I'll maybe ask Nikki to phone you. So you'd need to get a message to Nikki in the chat, and she'll phone you. I think would be the best way to sort it, because there's not much else I can do. I'm really sorry. Okay, so that's the three people from the Land Commission, and I'm here too. And I'm currently the chairman of the Land Commission, have been for about 6 years, I suppose. Previously chaired various public bodies, Scottish Canals, Scottish Natural Heritage, one of the national parks at one time, so see, a long time ago now. And I'm also on the board of the Crofting Commission, if you want to talk about crofting, though it's not hugely relevant to Edinburgh, but it is important to Scotland. Now, so one of the sort of signatures of the Land Commission since day one actually has been these monthly public meetings, and we in December 2016 onwards, we set out to hold public meetings all over Scotland every month, more or less. I think we didn't do July because of school holidays. And it's worked pretty well, actually. I mean, up until the pandemic, we were out there in village halls and hotels and so on. And it was really important because, people think of land reform and everyone has a view about what land reform is about, but actually, A, it's about lots of different things, and B, the priorities and the circumstances vary hugely around Scotland. It is simply not the case that land reform priorities are the same in Shetland as they are in Gretna Green or even in Edinburgh. And as both Davids have flagged, they are specialists in urban land reform, and that's not surprising given that we're talking to people in and around Edinburgh. But of course, lots of people who live in and around Edinburgh or Glasgow have a real interest in rural land reform and vice versa. So it's not so straightforward. So we've held these public meetings every month. They've been really important. They've informed us, and crucially, they've informed the work programme that we do, because we're a tiny wee body and really very small. Couldn't possibly do everything at once, have to prioritise. So these meetings help prioritise this, and I'll say a bit more about that in due course. We moved online during the pandemic. We actually found it worked better online because people told us that whereas if we were in the local pub or the village hall, it was often difficult to get to the thing, especially if you didn't have a car or you had kids, small kids or whatever. And people told us they preferred this. So that's why we're now doing it online, and it does seem to work. But feedback, please. There'll be a link to provide feedback if you want. That would be really helpful. The format that seems to work, and so we'll stick with it unless it stops working, is that I'll give a wee sort of overview of what we're about, what we're doing. It'll be only about 15 minutes or so, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because not everyone is necessarily on the same page. Some people are land reform geeks who follow these things very closely and know more about it than I do. And other people are just rather interested and happen to see this on Twitter or something. I thought they'd join in. So I'll try and give you a quick overview. But really, the purpose of this evening is to have a conversation with you. And as usual, I can't get the slides to move. There we go. So there's a chat button in your bar, the bar on the screen. And if you click on that chat button, it enables you to put comments into the chat, and we can all see those. So as I'm sort of doing my wee presentation, if there are particular things that you want us to talk about and discuss, please stick that into the chat. It'll be really helpful. Because my job is to make sure that this evening is as useful to you as it can be. And I can only do that if I know what you're interested in. So please use that chat function. And indeed, throughout the evening, I will be encouraging you to put your hand up, the yellow hand on the bar, and talk. But if you would prefer, for whatever reason, to simply type into the chat what you want to say, of course, that's super. So please use that. I promise now to finish no later than 8:30. So that's what we said. And people who know me know that I've got a bad habit of being quite rude sometimes and closing meetings bang on time. But that's part of my completed finisher characteristic. I can't help it. So we will finish on at 8:30. So that said, I'm just going to leave you to type into chat as and when you wish. And I'm just going to tell you a wee bit about what we do and so on and so forth. So what is land reform is a question that almost everyone gives a different answer to, and it's quite difficult for us because we were set up to advise government and landowners and other people, organisations, about land reform. So everyone kind of knows that it's something to do with the fact that Scotland has the most concentrated pattern of land ownership in Europe, that 400 people own over half of all the land in Scotland, that means that power is concentrated in relatively few hands in some circumstances. People know that. And people know that throughout the last 200 years, at least, it's been quite a fraught subject. That slide is actually the site that was squatted on by the Battersea Raiders, a famous case where they all ended up in court in London. People also know that land reform's got something to do with tenancy, tenant farming or crofting, and the rights of tenants versus the rights of landlords. And over the last 100 years, probably more, those rights have rebalanced from time to time through law. Both tenant farming and crofting are regulated forms of tenure where government, on behalf of the people, on behalf of society, regulates the balance of rights between landlord and tenant. So that's very important to us. But there are lots of new things coming along. So, I mean, possibly the one that's causing the most contentiousness at the moment is this business of people buying up land to sequester carbon or to restore biodiversity, claim credits for that and get paid for it through some mechanism or other. And it's in its infancy, but what it's doing is it's called, people call it natural capital. Some people don't like that term, but it's in common use, so I'll use it. What it certainly is doing is causing land values to soar in Scotland, quite extraordinary. Land doubling, trebling in some areas of the country within 12 months. It is quite extraordinary. And we're publishing, I think it's tomorrow, the latest update on what's happening in the land market in Scotland. So you'll see all that then, but I can tell you a bit about it now. But it is extraordinary what's happening. And among other things, it's actually degraded rubbish land that is beginning to fetch, or certainly is rising the fastest, because what people want to do is they want to buy peatland that's been completely trashed by previous owners, restore it, and then claim carbon credits, because I think people know that as we move towards net zero, more and more carbon credits are going to be tradable. And already, people who brew beer, people who sell insurance policies are buying land in order to offset their carbon emissions. So it's happening already. So that's one new big contentious area. Another less contentious perhaps, but hugely important, is the fact that Scotland has some of the worst record on vacant and derelict land in Western Europe. It's atrocious. What happened, particularly after the Second World War, many other parts of Europe worked really hard to restore the mess that had been made of the place during the war. But until pretty recently, we were really quite slow off the mark in Scotland. A lot of this land is not nothing to do with the war. It's post-industrial, it's contaminated, all sorts of things. But in the last, I think since about 2018, thereabouts, certainly in the last few years, since we started recording these things, actually we've done a good job. Something like 25% of vacant and derelict land has been brought back into productive use of some sort in Scotland. And we've worked really hard at this. And it's hugely important to urban settlements. And it's particularly important to socially disadvantaged areas of central Scotland, because that's where most of the vacant and derelict land tends to be. And having a big vacant and derelict site right next to your house or your school or whatever is deeply damaging. There are other things that people know about, which I'll just mention quite briefly. I mean, I think everyone knows that how we plan and manage land use is important, and it's contentious. And we have a planning system for some things like windmills or houses, but then other things, we don't have a planning system. You can pretty much do what you like, surprisingly unregulated. So that's an area where we've been working on things like local land use partnerships and things like that to try and bring some sort of planning to it. Similarly, compulsory powers still in fact, local authorities have, under certain circumstances, a power of compulsory purchase. We've actually suggested turning that on its head and thinking about a power of compulsory sale. If you own land and you're not doing something useful with it, maybe you should be made to sell it. So that's another area we're working on. People know, I think, that since 2003-04, Scotland has had some of the most progressive access rights in Europe. We all have a right of responsible access to most of Scotland, in contrast to England and Wales. Sharp contrast, actually. So that's really positive. But of course, e-bikes, e-scooters, paddle boards, they weren't even invented in 2003-04. So got to keep up with that. Community ownership started in the 90s. Really, I think I was involved in one of the very first ones. And it started because there were one or two landowners who were so appalling that communities got up in arms and said, look, we're just going to have to buy this to sort it out. But it's taken off in a big way. Huge amounts of land now owned by communities. 75% of people in the Western Isles live in community-owned land, for example, less so in other places. Loads of interesting things in Edinburgh with community-owned land and buildings. And across the country, you've got community-owned churches, toilets, bridges, cinemas, all sorts of things. So a big success story in some ways, but still a long way to go. Big challenge, one we haven't frankly made much progress with in Scotland, is the whole business of diversifying ownership and coming up with new kinds of tenure. If you go to other countries in Europe, it isn't quite the same sort of binary, you either own it or you don't. You may have 3 or 4 different interest groups owning different interests in the same piece of land. The nearest we've got to with that is where salmon fishing rights have been separated from land rights. In other parts of Europe, it's much more complex, and we are doing quite a lot of work at the moment on new ownership models to deal with that. We did experiment a bit between the wars with the hutting movement, where the hut belongs to someone, but the land belongs to the landowner. It wasn't a huge success because the tenure wasn't secure, and in fact, very few of those remain. That's my granny's hut, where I spent a lot of my childhood. It's a great place. It was, I should say, burnt to the ground by the landlord at the end. So it's not always a happy story. You can't get away from tax and financial support in relation to land. We, the taxpayer, you, the taxpayer, spend a great deal of money incentivizing farmers and landowners all over the country to do things, plant trees, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. And landowners enjoy a rather different tax regime to most of the rest of us. There are quite a lot of exemptions. And in fact, one landowner recently told me that the only reason he owns land is because of the tax exemptions, which I thought was very honest of him. So we've been doing some work on that. And lastly, but I do want to flag this, the biggest issue for an awful lot of young people in Scotland, including my own children, is the fact that house prices have grown way ahead of inflation over the last 30 years. And what's interesting about that is that the cost of building a house has broadly kept pace with inflation. It's the cost of the land underneath it that's rocketed. So we've got to crack that. We've done a lot of work. Both Davids are very knowledgeable about all that. But we simply cannot continue with the current situation where people are not just paying ludicrous amounts for a house, but then basically locking themselves up for the rest of their life to pay it off. We've got to address this. So the Land Commission, we were created by Parliament in 2017 because I think there was a recognition, cross-party recognition. The creation was supported by across the parties. There was a recognition that Scotland got to do something about these issues, and that it was being done in too piecemeal a way, that we needed a small body to really think about it, to provide advice, serious recommendations. So we're a national organisation. We cover the whole of Scotland. We're a very small organisation. We have just over a dozen staff. And Parliament also said that they would require us to design our work programme in 3-year bites. And each 3-year strategic plan, as they called it, has to be approved and laid before Parliament. So Parliament's keeping pretty close tabs on us, which I think is a good thing. I'm not against that. And we are just coming to the end, actually, of our second 3-year plan, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And everything we do is based on a fundamental concept which was set into law in the Land Reform Act 2016. And that is a straightforward principle that you cannot own land rights in Scotland unless you're prepared to accept and take on the responsibilities that go with it. That's a profound concept. It's a really fundamental concept. It's not one that everyone fully accepts now, but most people do. And, in shorthand, with land rights go responsibilities. The two are inextricable. And that drives pretty much everything. And it's a very important thing in Scotland. Over the last 3 years, we've focused on 3 things. I'm going to tell you a wee bit about it, but not an awful lot. Reforming land rights. With land rights comes an awful lot of power. And so we've done a lot of thinking about, so how might we reform and adjust land rights so that land rights are wholly compatible with the public interest, with the rights of everybody else. Not easy, and we've done a lot of thinking on that. Secondly, as I said, you can't own land rights unless you fulfill responsibilities. So who's going to hold people accountable? How's that going to work? So a whole raft of work on ensuring that people are accountable and that they do fulfill their responsibilities. And thirdly, it's the business of land markets. Land markets can work very well, but sometimes they don't. People, for example, speculators can sit on land for a very long time, and that may not be in the public interest, particularly if the bit of land being sat on happens to be right next to where your community lives. So that's one example. Other examples are just the crazy prices that are being paid for some types of land that may or may not be in the public interest. So quite a lot of thought about land markets over the last 3 years. That's been our focus. Here's a quick flavor of what we've been doing in detail. So we were asked to develop some serious thinking about how we might address the problem of concentrated land ownership in Scotland, far and away the most concentrated in Western Europe. We produced a range of proposals, mainly about strengthening the controls on power, but also a public interest test, so that actually if you're going to sell or transfer a large holding of land, there is an intervention. Commonplace in France and many other parts of Europe, Denmark, for example, doesn't happen here yet. There's been a consultation. I expect that bill towards the end of the year in draft form. Secondly, we've continued to work with others on the maintaining momentum on community ownership. It's been developing for a while. There is the Scottish Land Fund, which provides quite good assistance. A lot of communities have done a lot of crowdfunding, and some purchases, Egg, for example, Neudart, for example, the community purchased the land entirely through crowdfunding and without recourse to the land fund. It's very diverse, I've said. There is law in place that creates a community right to buy in extreme circumstances. Sorry about the initials, just to fit it on the slide. CRTB is community right to buy. But the European Convention on Human Rights, that's legislation that comes through in the Human Rights Act in this country, is a constraint. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. What we're working on now actually is a really interesting idea, which is, does it have to be either a private owner or a community owner? Is it really binary? Is there not a shared model? For example, if you're buying an estate in order to offset your carbon emissions, that's probably your only interest. So do you really need, what else do you need? Why not actually buy it, but either jointly own it with the community or put it into some sort of long-term arrangement where the community gradually take ownership as you no longer need it. There's lots of different possibilities. I'm just going to mention this because it is so important. Lots of people say, well, why doesn't the government just get in there and force these guys to give up their land or split up their land or whatever else? And it's not just guys, it's women too who own land in Scotland. There must be, under human rights law, a public interest justification, and the courts are required, if there's a challenge, to strike a fair balance between the interest of the rest of us and the rights of individual property owners. And that's a very, very difficult area for government to get right. There have been challenges. There was one a while ago now where actually the property owners won the case, so it's not easy. Leaving aside the whole legal thing, we've also put a lot of resource into saying, well, what does good look like? What does responsible look like? Because actually an awful lot of people who own land in Scotland are perfectly willing to behave responsibly, they just don't quite know what it looks like. So we've done a lot of work developing and publishing good practice protocols, as we call them, but also other things, guidance, and we run seminars and all sorts of things, spelling out what responsible looks like. That's been pretty successful, actually, and I have to take my hat off to most landowners. The vast majority have come on board to that. And in fact, the chief executive of Scottish Lands and Estates, the sort of trade body for Scottish landowners, said on a public platform that she thought that these protocols were the script that landowners should be following. So I was really encouraged by that. But they are voluntary. The 2016 Act did however, put into place a slightly more robust piece of legislation in relation to tenant farming, but only tenant farming, where there is a tenant farming commissioner. She or he, it's he at the moment, hopefully she next time round, puts in place codes of practice. People are required to follow those. He has statutory powers to investigate if there's allegations that people haven't followed them, and he can name and shame, and that may potentially have implications for access to grants and all sorts of things. He does some other things too, which I mentioned there, but the one that's I think most significant is that we have the beginnings of a statutory code of practice system now in Scotland. I've mentioned vacant and derelict land, so I'm not going to say much more about it, but it is really important and is, I think, for people living in urban Scotland, probably one of the most impactful areas of our work. Housing, we've done a lot of this. David Stewart's led it. I think it's been very important. Essentially, David, forgive me, I'm going to summarize your thinking, which is terrible. But I think in essence, what we've said is, first of all, that the way in which land's brought forward at the moment is not really fit for purpose, because it's essentially, it's up to the landowner whether land is brought forward for housing or not. We don't actually have much control over that, which is unusual in a European context. And secondly, and perhaps because of that, we therefore have a sort of rather speculative model in Scotland, driven by the private sector, which actually isn't delivering houses fast enough in the right places at the right time at the right price to properly serve the public interest. And so what we're saying is, we need to learn, let's not reinvent wheels here, let's look at what other people in Europe, continental Europe do, and let's be more robust in our approach to housing. Tax, we've done some work, we possibly should and possibly will be doing some more, I don't know yet. What we have said, and I think it's an important thing just to say very clearly, is that not only can tax influence how land is used and how land is owned, but also there's an awful lot of value tied up in that. About half the nation's value, just over half the nation's total capital is tied up in land. So there's value to be taxed there as well. It needs more work. It's not simple. There are lots of unforeseen consequences if you get it wrong. So it's not straightforward, but I suspect it's going to get more work. And that brings me just to the last couple of things. So in September, we must table before Parliament our plans for the next 3 years. So we're thinking about that now. So everything you contribute this evening will help us with that. So please contribute and tell us what you think we should be doing over the next 3 years. And we'll try and distill that and present it to Parliament. I think it's going to be dominated by this thing called the just transition, which government is talking about, which is a transition, in essence, the transition to net zero, to net zero. And how do you make that fair and just? It's going to be very, very difficult. It's potentially a big threat to rural communities in particular, because jobs on farms and jobs in other things may no longer exist. And jobs on forestry or whatever, or blocking up peat drains and things, they may not be the same in character, because they may be contract jobs. People may come in and out. So it's going to be those sorts of things, I think, but there will be all sorts of other things in there. Everybody and his dog will have a view about what the priorities are for the next 3 years, and we really need to hear from them, please. Just briefly, in case you thought we only have an influence in Scotland, we are increasingly being listened to and paid attention to south of the border and in Wales and even in Ireland, actually, in Northern Ireland anyway. And interestingly, the recent report from the House of Lords pretty much prints the title of our first strategic plan, so they must be reading it. So it's encouraging, I think, that we are beginning to gain credibility in that way. We've created this wee hub for people who want to learn more about what other people are doing, not about our work, but about what communities and what groups and so on are doing with their land to get ideas. Lots of people are doing lots of amazing things. So please have a look at that if you want to see what's happening around Edinburgh, around the Lothians, or indeed out west in the rest of urban central Scotland or beyond. As for us, that's our website. There's a huge wealth of stuff on that website. Now we keep on adding to it. If nothing else, it's a great cure for insomnia, but it is actually a very, very good source of information. So please use it. That's our contact email and that's our contact phone number. And I'll refer back to those at the end. But I am now going to stop sharing my screen and ask you to join us in a conversation. So let me make sure that works. There we are. Right. So that I hope has been helpful. Really, what I want now is to hear from you. What are the things that matter to you? And I appreciate, although this is about Edinburgh, what matters to you may be about something to do that happened, in remote rural Scotland. That's absolutely fine. What we want to know is what matters to you. So use the chat, stick your hand up. If you go to, let me just get the bit, I think it's in, no, I've forgotten the, Nikki, can you tell me which button to put your yellow hand up, please? I've forgotten now. Too many of these things.
Yeah, sure. So
yeah,
our view will be slightly different, but I can see we already have a hand up from Neil. And if anyone wants to put their hand up, I believe if you click the 3 dots on the bottom right that says more, there's an option there that says raise hand.
Brilliant. And Neil, you're obviously ahead of the curve. Thank you for that. I figured that out. Neil, let's hear from you. And I'm also following the chat, Barbara, in case you think I hadn't.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It was an interesting presentation. I am a councillor here in Edinburgh, and I see Tim is on the call as well. So I used to be, under the last administration, an SNP Labour coalition, the planning convener. And something that does me a lot is land value uplift. There's a lot of estates. In the new plan that I worked quite a lot for, we've located the new housing next to the tramway, so there is infrastructure there. But in the ones that were put into the previous LDP local development plan, there's real lack of infrastructure. And there would be, if there's only so much land next to the tramway, so in another 10 years' time, there won't be a tramway that we can plug into, and who would then pay for the tram or something like that Edinburgh needs to have sustainable growth. So, that currently, as you know, I'm sure extremely well, Andrew, the farmer or the landowner pockets a lot of the money, just takes it out of the system. And ultimately, the public sector, like the tram, was paid for by Scottish Government and Edinburgh Council. £1 billion went over budget, but it's still a good investment, I think, for the long term. But it seems a very unfair system that the private sector, landowners and developers can underprovide, perhaps often, in terms of infrastructure for things like trams, or I know there's Section 75s for schools and so on, but it's still the massive difference between agricultural land value and building land value seems to be an unfair system. So I just wondered what your thoughts were there, and if it's something that you could take to the government to try and, I know people have thought about it in the past, because that was really, I'll finish now because I want to hear from you and your colleagues, but that's how the way the Scottish new towns were built in the past. I think it was the 1945 Planning Act, which 1963 legislation overrid. But that's how we built East Kilbride and places like that through that kind of difference. And that's how Edinburgh built its housing estates in the past, I think, when land values were a lot cheaper. We could build places like Broomhouse and Hilton and stuff like that, but now we couldn't possibly purchase large swathes of land in the same way. Okay, I'll shut up now and hear from you, if that's okay. Thank you, please.
Neil, thanks very much. No, you're absolutely right about the new towns. That's exactly what happened. It was bought at agricultural value, and the uplift was then used to finance infrastructure. Neil, just before I'm going to ask David Adams to respond, but Neil, I've lost Neil, but the thing is, if you can, yeah, oh yeah, there you are, Neil. I just before I turn to David, can you? I want to push you slightly because you're a councillor. So, what are the powers that you don't have that you want? Do you have a view on that, or do you want to hear from David first?
Well, I would like a lot of powers, but the problem is, I guess it's at the Scottish government level and probably not a UK government level, but you know, between 45 and 63, or whenever the then government changed the rules, we were in some way able to capture land value, and we're not really. We have Section 75 as a planning instrument, and it pays for contributions to schools and health now, and some other things, some level of transport, but only so far, and only relative to the individual development. But maybe land value uplift would allow us to accumulate more and plan a bit more strategically. So I don't know if that answers your question on that one. Obviously, we could ask for a lot more powers in many areas. I can't think just yet. I might come back into the call later, but I won't waffle. I'll just leave it at that at the moment and hear from David.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, sorry, I put you on the spot there, but David, a huge subject,
yeah.
and you over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Neil. That's a really excellent question. I think it all comes down to who is the prime mover in development. And as Neil rightly says, that we moved to a situation where the local authority, the New Town Development Corporation, so on and so forth, is very much in the background, and the prime mover in development is the private landowner, the private developer, to whom the local authorities react as best they can. And part of that reaction is to obviously to try and extract what community benefits one can do through all the existing legislation that there is. Actually, I wouldn't have started from there. That's the problem. And what the Land Commission has consistently said, and we have published a very detailed recommendations on this in August 2021 on housing. That has been preceded by a whole series of research reports and earlier publications, and it basically said that the local authorities and development corporations, whatever it should be, has to get back to being the prime mover, the place promoter in overall charge of the whole process. Because actually, you can try and refine Section 75 as long as you want, but it's the issue is one of power, and unless you can exercise power of being overall control of what's happening, and this is especially for large development schemes, not necessarily for small development schemes, but unless you can be the prime mover, prime promoter, you're always going to be on the back foot. And the developers, landowners will be offering what they can, but that will never be enough. Now, I think Neil makes the point about compensation of being able to acquire land at very low values, which actually was the case during a particular period of time in the 1950s under particular legislation. Now, the only way you can get back to something like that is if it's never feasible for landowners, developers to go on strike, because the reason that system broke down is that as the state started to retreat from being the prime mover, the landowners and developers demanded that they basically got more of the slice of the cake. And that's back to power and back to who's in charge. So if you simply went back to, if you simply reintroduced that legislation in the 1950s, but didn't do what the Commission has suggested, which is to set up a land agency in Scotland to enable local authorities through the necessary finance. I suspect finance is more important than powers, but the necessary finance to be prime movers and developers in development. You would be back to a situation where development grounds to halt, because history tells us landowners, developers would then go on strike. So in summary, these are really important issues. And sometimes the answer is not actually easily understood, which is why, or easily apparent, which is why before making our quite detailed recommendations, to which I should say we're still waiting for a formal response from the Scottish Government, but before making all those detailed recommendations, the Commission undertook a whole series of research studies, all of which are available on our website. So our recommendations are evidence-based on what has worked in the UK and what has worked in other European countries and could be made to work in Scotland if the powers that be had the political will to make it work. Thanks, Andrew.
David, thanks. So, Neil, that was a slightly housing-focused answer to your question. I appreciate, but the key, the guts of it, I think, is absolutely clear that we are saying, look, we need a more assertive, more muscular local government sector with stronger powers if we're going to address some of these things. Now, Tim, I can see your hand. I just want to go to Barbara's point. Barbara put into. I need to be fair to people who are putting up hands and using the chat, otherwise this would be iniquitous. So Barbara's flagging issues about planning and off-grid homes in particular, and I imagine David Stewart, you can see that message anyway. But David, do you want to just maybe some wider thoughts? David was the key thinker and author behind the housing report. There's a link actually there for you if you want it. David, some wider thoughts about housing. And this whole business of a more assertive local authority, but also if you could address Barbara's point, because Barbara's point is actually about the private sector wanting to come forward with off-grid homes and struggling with the public sector. It's almost the opposite problem. So, David Stewart.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Well, firstly, I fully agree with everything Professor Adams said on housing. I think there's quite an opportunity now, perhaps, with the new National Planning Framework and the 2019 Planning Act, that they make a very clear intention to focus on net zero, almost as their overriding priority, and to move from development of greenfield land on the edge of towns and cities to land reuse and brownfield development. And I think that's an opportunity to move to the sort of public interest-led development that we recommended and that Professor Adams was talking about. I was actually on a development forum for developers in North Lanarkshire today, and there's quite a bit of concern there about how will they deliver in this new move to brownfield development or town centre housing. And I think an appreciation that they need the skills and an active public sector. So perhaps that's an opportunity to move towards more the sort of approach that the Land Commission recommended, and I think that your question implies, Neil. As far as the question about low carbon homes and small homes, it's sometimes difficult without knowing the actual exact location, but it does seem to me again that with this complete focus on net zero and the National Planning Framework, and there's also a call there that development should be very much based around what's suitable for the place. So the idea that's outlined of having very low impact homes and an environment that also, enables food production certainly sounds something that in principle could fit in with National Planning Framework 4 and the new Planning Act, but it would really be down to the particulars of the site and of course the local authority. But just to conclude, all local authorities will be producing new local development plans over the next few years as a result of the new Planning Act. That may be an opportunity for the proposals that you talk about, Barbara.
David, thanks. So Neil, I'm going to move the conversation on, but the point about value sharing is a really important one. Thanks for raising it right up front at the beginning. We are not good, I don't think, it's fair to say, in Scotland. Well, it's not just Scotland, but I mean, to be fair, it is difficult. You've got to incentivize if you want people to bring land forward and build on it. But on the other hand, it is not reasonable for people to make inappropriate profits, particularly if they're doing so while the public purse, in other words, your taxes, my taxes, and everybody else's taxes, are being used to provide the infrastructure. That is just fundamentally wrong, and we've said that pretty clearly. But I'm going to stick to the wall for the moment anyway, this whole business of value sharing, because it may be there's more work that we need to do there. On the planning point, Barbara, absolutely. I mean, David's right. I'm not quite sure where your site is. And anyway, I'm not going to comment about a planning authority because that'd be interfering in a democratic matter, which would be wrong. I mean, they are answerable to you, not me, whoever they are. But the point there's a wider point, which is, I think we are going to have to innovate in planning and be more imaginative, and we are going to have to take perhaps some risks. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere near the net zero ambitions that we're talking about, at least in terms of housing's contribution to that. So thanks for that. Now, Tim, you were trying to get in, and I want to let you in, and I apologize for holding you back. And I should just say, Penny, that I haven't forgotten your question, but it's on a different subject. So let's hear from Tim.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, just a couple of points. One is, I think, is following on from the conversation we've just had about housing and land values and so forth. And then moving on to something that's totally different, really. But just, I mean, in terms of, I live in the centre of Edinburgh, and I'm involved with the city councillor now, and previously before that was involved in my community council. And I know that the communities where they want to see housing development in the city, and they want to see preferably affordable housing development in the city. There's no, if you asked anybody in the streets of, where I stay in the centre of Edinburgh, that is, you can guarantee that's what they would say. And yet, 9 times out of 10, what we actually get is student accommodation. And I know there's a place for student accommodation, and we need place accommodation for students, don't get me wrong, but we just don't get affordable housing or even housing. And when I spoke to a housing association about specific sites in very local to where I live, and they just said, the market would just price them out of the question, they would just be priced out of the market completely. They couldn't compete at all with student accommodation developers, couldn't even get near in terms of what would make sites viable for them. So I think this is the sort of continuation of the conversation we've had. It's just say, what would be the Land Commission's proposals be to mean that affordable housing developers could get into the market, and it could become viable for them, rather than just, and that communities can actually get what they want in their local areas. But I want, if I can sort of just I can raise a second and totally different point as well, whilst I've got people's attention. This is a very, very personal thought, and nothing to do with the council or the council's policies or where they are. I'm totally certain that the council is fully encouraging and supportive of community ownership. But when I personally was in the community council, and we would have discussions sometimes about community ownership, I was always very, very nervous as a member of the community, because clearly, you are taking on a huge responsibility, and to actually, have the the wherewithal and the commitment in every regard, you know, whether that be legal or just practical, to actually fulfill that commitment as a representative community in terms of community ownership. And I know there's, you know, fantastic things going on, as you say. And I also worry a little bit that, you know, right here and now, there might be a really enthusiastic group of individuals who want to purchase their local unused, whatever it is, church hall or something, and do great things with it. But what happens, you know, I worry, what happens when those people move on? You know, they're not going to be around forever. They're going to pass away, not be so active. You know, what happens if there aren't people within that community who are coming forward and say, yeah, no problem, I'll take on all the responsibility. No, I worry that there's too much responsibility on individual, the community, and, you know, we're asking too much is my concern. So that's a totally new point, if you like to go with that.
Yeah, thanks. I'll come on to community ownership. I'm just going to try and wrap up on the housing, but I'm going to ask you, Tim, if you don't mind, the same question I asked Neil. You're a councillor. What are the powers you need to deal with the student housing thing?
Well, I mean, in that regard, I mean, you know, I would like to somehow make it viable for that housing association to be able to build on those sites, to intervene in the market, I guess, in order that, you know, I understand that whoever landowners are, they own land for a reason. They're there to make an investment, but to somehow kind of temper that in order that community interest can also be generated. And by that, I mean the community interest to see more affordable housing built within their communities.
Can I just come in?
Yes, Dave, I was going to ask you, David. So you know, there's Tim, a frustrated councillor trying to do the right thing and not having the tools.
I think this is a discussion to be had with planning professionals as how creatively the development plan system is being used. That the development plan is really important in valuation terms in determining what value professional value is put on land. And if I can give you an example, that I was involved in a campaign to save some urban green space that was actually surrounded by housing. The landowners thought that this should be valued at housing value. In fact, the professional values, because of the development plan, put a value much, much closer, almost close to amenity value on it. And I think planners perhaps need to have a stronger understanding of the relationship between the way in which development plans are constructed and how that can be used to bring the value of particular sites down to more realistic levels, because it can be, it simply demands a very robust local development plan. And it demands a lot of evidence and councillors who are prepared to stick behind it and not be flexible, because the more flexibility that you have in your development plan, the more speculation there will be, and the more opportunity is for people to benefit from buying land at some value and actually selling it on at another value. So I think there is a need for local authorities to be creative in the way they construct the development plans, whether that's protecting urban green space, whether it's protecting land for social housing, whether it's protecting land for community business, whatever it happens to be. It is possible to do it. It's quite hard, but it's possible to do it. And it needs a very clear, determined authority with a clear plan that they're going to stick to. Thanks, Andrew.
Now, it's nearly 8 o'clock, and I don't want to spend the entire evening talking about planning and housing, because I appreciate that Penny, for example, has been patiently waiting to talk about biodiversity and diversity of ownership. But there's 3 hands up, so I'm going to give you a chance to, all 3 of you, just say something quickly if it's about housing. If it's not about housing, I'll move on to another subject. Neil, is it the same subject?
Yeah, it's on housing, and it was actually, I have a degree of sympathy, Barbara, with Barbara's issue of building in the countryside. I just wanted, and particularly in Scotland, because everyone on the call will know, you know, the Highland clearances, and we had lowland clearances, which are not so well recorded. So if you go out with any settlement in Scotland, you see virtually nobody lives in the countryside because they were cleared off, either through economics or actually forced off the land in many places, unlike many other countries in Europe. But I just wanted to kind of caution how we, if I could, in Edinburgh, because I represent the Pentland Hills ward, which is a quarter of the city area. So there's a lot of rural areas, and what we wouldn't, in our local plan, we're still restricting building in the countryside. And the reason for that is it wouldn't be the kind of development that Barbara's talking about, of sustainable development using the land well, which I have a lot of sympathy for. It would probably be a lot of kind of suburban housing out in the countryside, driving into the city, creating more journeys through urban areas, pollution and all that sort of thing. So I do have a lot of sympathy with Barbara. I'm not proposing a solution today. I'm just giving a slightly alternative caution on that one. And just wanted to pick up a point that was developed from what Tim was saying, and the comments that came back from David about in Edinburgh, we're going to up, hopefully, if our plan goes through, the percentage that has to be provided in terms of affordable in the new local plan to a third approximately. It needs to be affordable on sites. But one problem that's occurring in central Edinburgh, because there's a lot of stone buildings in the World Heritage area, the build costs, not just the land costs, but the build costs for housing associations is so high. And we have commuted sums, and we can move them from development to development. But it's just maybe if taking David's point on board, maybe planning authorities almost need to think about the build cost. And I don't know how you could factor that in economically, because it is resulting in, even where planning wise there should be affordable, they just can't build on that site affordable. They would maybe get mid-market at best. So it just means hollowing out of communities in central Edinburgh. So there's a lot more to think about there, and I'm happy to speak to David offline, perhaps, the Davids and so on. But we need solutions to this, and I don't have the answers. But Andrew, you did say you wanted to collect views and so on. So I just thought I'd put those out there. So thanks for giving me the chance to come back in again.
Absolutely, we haven't got all the answers at all. We're here to hear the issues. So Neil, thanks very much. Barbara, there's a sympathetic councillor, so let's hear from Barbara.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be saying something controversial here or not, but
go for it.
What I'm trying to do is to look at a whole new way of living, and to look at a whole way new of existing and thinking about the climate. That's very much at the forefront of what I'm trying to do with the thing that we are producing up in our farm. And it seems to me that isn't even being discussed, is how we're living this same thing over and over, and we're just building, we're creating all this stuff. But how are we going to survive as a species if our climate is going to start deteriorating so much? Even my farm has started to deteriorate because of the situation with the climate. And to me, it's all about building, but without actually looking at the infrastructure, which is what we need to be built to putting in there green space that we can grow things, that we can grow food, because this is all part of what this is all about. And to me, it's like we're still in this ethos of building more stuff, making more money. And eventually education is going to be such that we're going to have to educate people to actually look at sustainable living in a different way. And I'm very passionate about this, as you could probably hear in my voice, but I follow this gentleman called Michael Tellinger from the One Small Town. And I think that's something that perhaps everybody needs to look at, how each community, and with even in cities, it's possible to actually look at sustainable living and how we can help people to get on, yes, to buy it, to have a roof over their head, but it doesn't have to be a massive house that everybody lives in, these massive houses. It's it's an educate, putting houses, and you need schools, you need all these things as well. And these infrastructures aren't happening in some places. And this is what the whole program that we're trying to build is to look at sustainable living, how we can live together off the land, using everything that we have and making sure that we protect the climate. And that's all I'm going to say. Sorry.
Well, that's brilliant, but that's brilliant. Thank you for saying it. And what you've absolutely put into our minds very firmly is that the just transition and the priorities in our third next plan, which will focus on just transition, have to be about urban issues, about housing issues, and so on. It's not just about peat and forestry. So thank you for reminding us. David Adams would have reminded us if you hadn't, but that's very helpful. Thank you. David's always on with it. Now, I'm juggling things a wee bit, but I'm just wanting to hear from Marcus because he's been so patient and I don't even know what he wants to ask about. Marcus, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm drawing back to the point that Tim ended on, which is around community ownership. So I work at the University of Edinburgh, and one of the things I've been doing is I'm working with small community groups that are in the process of going through the community asset transfer scheme, which they are finding terribly complicated and arduous process. You know, the demands are so high for people who do this in their voluntary time and with little expertise or experience. And also, I think they're feeling that the nature of the evaluations and the quality and nature of those by the other parties, Forestry and Land Scotland and Forestry, Scottish Forestry, I think kind of they're I think they're a bit downbeat, about how these are conducted, etc. So I just wondered whether any of these observations that I've had in these engagements are some that you share, and whether there are any sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of perhaps streamlining the processes and, you know, thinking about the role of, or the way in which these schemes work for community ownership in particular.
Marcus, thanks. Brilliant segue into community ownership, which is one of the areas that Penny and others have flagged. I'm just going to close the housing discussion, though, by just pointing to the chat. Points being made by Penny in the chat about that. Our housing report's up there. And a point made by David Adams, which is important. So one of our staff was a member, or may still be a member, for all I know, of the Liverpool Land Commission. And they are also doing some important work, and we must, the Scottish Land Commission is extremely keen to pinch other people's ideas. We've been looking all over Europe to do that, so we'll happily pinch theirs. So there's something to have a look at. I think I do need to move on from housing, though. It's 8:05. So community ownership, lots of dimensions to it. Points being made by Tim about risk, about confidence, about capacity. You didn't quite say it, but I'll say it, Tim, the risk that only middle-class communities do go down this road and others don't. You know, I do think that's a serious risk, although oddly, the evidence is almost the opposite. One of the very interesting things is that you might think that it was people with time on their hands and all the rest of it, lots of lawyers in the community who would do it. Actually, it's often communities under pressure who are most likely to take things into their own hands. So that's really encouraging. The asset transfer process is not perfect. I think we'd agree with that. The community right to buy process is not perfect, partly because of your human rights law. David Stewart, forgive me, but I want to go to David Adams first, because David actually has first-hand experience in another, not as a land commissioner, but as part of a community trying to do this. So do you want to offer some thoughts, David Adams, on the whole, the challenges and the opportunities around community ownership in peri-urban areas?
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, again, it's an area where the Commission has done quite a lot of work, including looking at asset transfer, excuse me, and the community right to buy, and more informal ways in which communities acquire land. And I think it's fair to say the processes are indeed horrendously complex and enough to put anyone off who's not a bit mad. And maybe that's why you don't necessarily have all the lawyers involved, because they wouldn't waste time on it. So we have made a number of recommendations to government on ways in which the process could be improved, the ways streamlined. And there currently is a group that is led by the Commission and chaired by a fellow Commissioner across government looking at this. And I think, again, getting back to why we're in this position, because we're in this position because community right to buy has sort of grown incrementally from what was sort of a very simple concept early on, and a reasonably short piece of legislation in 2003, to then successive piece of legislation in 2015 and 16, that I think the one I was looking at was 70 pages in length, primary legislation alone, backed up by 2 or 3 statutory instruments, and so on and so forth. And it's not to put anyone off. So there's a real issue as to where the process is designed for civil servants and for people probably administrating it in the government who want to make sure all kinds of boxes are being ticked, or whether it's designed for the people who are trying to put it into effect in communities, which is really, really difficult. So I think in summary, the time has come to look again at all those pieces of legislation. The Commission is involved in trying to move this debate along, and trying to get something that is simple and it's the same rules across the piece and easily understood. So I think we've, by default, Andrew, I think we've got ourselves into a very complex position over the legislative routes to community ownership.
Yeah.
That's why they're not being used very well. And that's why most community buyouts actually don't make any use of them at all. They take place on a voluntary basis.
David, thanks. I could shove my oar in, but I won't, because Katie's got her hand up and I want to hear from Katie. Go for it, Katie. Let's have your thoughts.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I've just thought that was really interesting what you were saying there, David. And as someone, myself, I'm involved in a community group trying to purchase land. And just to say that we had support from the DTAS project. It was a DTAS Scottish Land Commission project, and that was like really tailored support looking at derelict land. And it was just really useful to have that sort of expert, because like people are saying, it's really difficult to know, like you're doing it in your spare time, you're not an expert. So that tailored support was absolutely excellent. One thing we really struggled with, and I still don't fully understand, is if ALIOs, which is arm's length organisations of councils and other bodies, are sort of within the scope. So that was something that we really struggled with, but hopefully that will progress now, and we've got the funding for it, so it's really good. And another thing I just was thinking about when you were speaking there, David, is I sometimes wonder if, not to say that rural communities don't have challenges, because of course they do, but in terms of community ownership, there's maybe different ones for urban and rural communities. So things like, for example, there's no fund for communities who would want to build urban housing, but there is for rural communities, and maybe that's because, you know, it would be much more difficult in an urban setting, even like maximum grant size awards for the Scottish Land Fund, but there's higher property values in urban areas, and also things like community right to buy, with like, if you've got a bigger community, a bigger population, you have to ballot, like things like that. So I think there are different challenges, and I would just like that to be addressed a wee bit more. But sorry, that was a bit of a rant, sorry.
No, it wasn't a rant, Katie. It was, that's really helpful because you've done it, and it isn't a perfect process, actually. So it's really good for you to say that. I'm going to round this one off because I've got other things people want to talk about. But David Stewart, do you want to say anything on this, or are you?
Yeah, just to be really brief, I think it's a really interesting point about urban community-led housing and the fact there isn't really funding. There's very interesting projects in Dumfries looking to regenerate the town centre, where they're almost trialling a community-led approach. It'd be very interesting to watch that and see if it actually leads to there being ring-fence funding in the way that there is for community-led rural housing, because I think there is a gap, and there are sites where developers and housing associations will tend not to build, and it's something communities could really deliver well. So really interesting to watch that space, I think.
David, thanks. No question that community ownership will continue to evolve. No question, I think, that there will continue to be political support for it. So actually feeding back what's working and what's not working is hugely important. So thanks for that, Katie. Before we get too depressed about this, there's an awful lot of things that are working really well on the community ownership front. I think it's worth saying that. I mean, I said before, 75% of people in the Western Isles live on community-owned land. That's an astonishing statistic. There are all sorts of good examples. Misty-Vale Quarter and Dumfries has just been mentioned, but there are many, many good examples. The Action Porty Group, for example, in Edinburgh, and there are many others in Edinburgh. So it has worked. What the difficulties almost invariably arise where you're trying to force an issue, because you come straight up against human rights legislation, and you need to be able to overcome the rights of the owner with a persuasive public interest case. And government has found that very, very difficult. But I am absolutely certain that the door is open, and I'm absolutely certain that this organisation, the Scottish Land Commission, will continue to see community land ownership as a priority, as David said. Right, now, I've now kind of lost track, not lost track, but I just want to go back up the thing, because I think it was it Penny? I think it was Penny at the beginning asked about, let me just see if I can find it. I think it was Penny, anyway, never mind. Asked about biodiversity, and I just want to try and pick this up. So I'm going to pick this one up myself, but I'd like to hear from anyone else who wants to chip in. I mean, land. So the principle that with land rights go responsibilities absolutely plays to the idea that you need to manage your land responsibly, and that includes looking after the biodiversity that's on that land responsibly, enhancing it, and so on and so forth. So that's there, and I think that will continue to be strengthened as government chooses to strengthen the emphasis on responsibility. I mentioned the protocols. There is a possible proposal in the land reform bill that's coming to change what we do from voluntary protocols to statutory-based codes of practice. I also, although it's not happened yet, it is much talked about that there will be some system of biodiversity credits where landowners will be incentivized. You need a stick and a carrot for these things. Landowners will be incentivized to improve biodiversity, and that there will be some form of credits which may even be tradable. And it is perfectly possible, I think, that the private sector will start to buy credits, because if you can get a premium price for a bottle of beer because at the same time you're adding to the biodiversity on somewhere or other, then you'll do that, and you'll add a premium price, and you'll spend some of that on biodiversity. So I actually think this is a really interesting area. Thank you for raising it. And I chaired SNH for 7 years and battled with these things then, but I think it's fast moving. So I'm just going to pause in case anyone else wants to talk about biodiversity, and then I'm going to talk about diversity of ownership. Neil.
I just wanted to stick more into this one as well. There is some sort of concern that these credits are subsidising very large landowners, and they're maybe thwarting community interest in a way, and more diverse ownership, and it makes land is a commodity, I guess, but it makes it attacks the sustainability thing. They're only in it for the money, kind of thing. I've read sort of debate about that. So, and you'll be aware, you're kind of nodding, so you're aware of that take on it. So there is the risk that we're using tax incentive and giving it to very people with a lot of resource already, and it's maybe not the best use of the public sector tax. Could it not be used in a more productive way to spread ownership, maybe in the way that Barbara was alluding to, and so on, and get more sustainability on the ground? An important bit of sustainability is ensuring people can live in the countryside and utilise the countryside. And so I'm not sure, I just wanted to take a different view to how you're, and the truth's probably somewhere in between the two things, but it's not all the way that you were necessarily alluding to there, Andrew. if you don't mind me saying. Just being a bit,
No, no,
there.
No, you're right, and you're absolutely right. And I'm the first to say it, and I've got myself into trouble several times for questioning whether the rush to invest in natural capital, as it's called, is all good, because it clearly isn't all good. If you have some of the big investors in natural capital in Scotland at the moment are simply accumulating land and creating a more concentrated pattern of land ownership, completely the opposite of policy. And that is partly because you've got public policy priorities to sequester carbon, to improve biodiversity, to some extent facing in the opposite direction to public policy priorities to maintain population in rural areas, to main numbers in rural schools, to diversify ownership of land more generally, and so on and so forth. And part of our job is to try and find a way of getting those policies to point in the same direction instead of opposite directions. And that will not be easy. So I completely buy that. I guess my word of caution is this. I think there is no question we have what some people call a biodiversity emergency, and we have what some people call a climate emergency. And I think most people would agree we must address those. So this is not an either or. It absolutely has to be both. The board of the Land Commission went down to Galloway last week and to have a look at things, because in some ways Galloway is at the front line of some of this stuff. And what was absolutely striking actually was that there wasn't enough thought being given to how do we keep kids in the schools, how do we maintain the village shop, how do we maintain population. There was a lot of thought being given to how can we flog that bit of land for the highest price to somebody who wants to sequester carbon or potentially sell biodiversity credits, which I should say don't actually exist yet. It's still a putative idea. So early days. We will publish a report, I think the 2nd or 3rd week of June, with quite a bit more. Nicky's nodding at me. Thanks, Nicky. With our sort of collected thinking on this. Sorry, I've got to nudge my screen. So, I mean, we are doing a lot of very serious thinking about this. It's a very difficult area. We will publish some further advice 2nd or 3rd week of June. And as I said, we're publishing a land market report tomorrow, which flags a lot of this stuff anyway. So you'll see all that. Now, 8:20. I've not shared this terribly well, but we've got one more subject, which is how do we diversify land ownership? I want just to cover that off. So I'll say a bit, but please butt in, stick your hand up or type into the thing. So, as I said earlier, ludicrously concentrated pattern of ownership. Consequence of that is that in some parts of the country, there is what amounts to a monopoly of landed power. They're localized monopolies, but they are monopolies of landed power. That's not in the public interest. Not because people necessarily misuse that monopoly, but they could misuse that monopoly, and they could abuse that monopoly. And they may misuse it without even realizing they are. So it's not in the public interest. So there will be a land reform bill towards the end of this year. At the moment, government is saying it will focus on the concentrated land ownership issue, and it will focus on measures to deal with that. So, and there would be two broad dimensions. One, putting much more robust accountability measures in there to people who do own large scalps of land, so that the power monopoly is weakened, significantly weakened in favor of the public interest. So that's point one. And point two, because it's difficult to force people to dispose of land, when they do dispose or transfer ownership of that land, there will be a public interest test, which says, as it does in France, is it in the public interest for this holding to remain as one or not? Which is no different from anywhere else in business. If you're selling if you own all the shops in a high street and want to sell them as one lump, you'll go straight up against the monopoly, what used to be called the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, competition policy. So it's not a new idea at all, this. But what it does mean is that if you fail the public interest test, you will be required to take some actions, which could be that you might be required to sell the property in lots so that power isn't concentrated, or you might be required to put some of the property into secure tenure so that some of the power shifts to tenants. It could be crofting if it's in the crofting counties, agricultural tenure, or you could be, you know, I'm not going to predict. It could be a heap of other things. The last thing I want to say, and then I'll see how people respond, is this isn't easy because under human rights law, you have the right to the peaceful enjoyment of your property, and that the government can only intervene if there's a clear public interest justification for doing this. It's not a straightforward matter of just saying, right, no one can own over 1,000 acres, and if you do, you'll have to give it up. We can't do that. Okay, that's enough from me. Any thoughts from anybody on that whole issue? Does it bother you? Goodness, that silenced you. Neil, again, go for it, Neil.
Nobody else wants to speak.
No,
Barb,
yeah, then Barbara.
I was out in the wards today, and I don't. Also, this is being recorded, but I need to be careful what I'm saying. But somebody alleged that a large landowner had made some properties in the countryside empty, and there is. I need to find out a little more of that, but I know it does happen in other bits of Scotland for sure. That, you know, like tenant farmers or cottages can be emptied, and so that's a bit of an abuse of power, really. Somebody that's lived in the country for many years, possibly generations, even can be turfed out of their property, and it's even worse than being in the city, because there are other properties in the city, but there might not be any property at all. So it's on my mind because I'd spoken to somebody who made this allegation to me. So obviously I need to be careful what I say there, but that was just as you're talking, Andrew, that struck in my head about that.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, we published a report, and there was no question that there was good evidence of misuse and abuse of power. Barbara, and then Andrew.
Yeah, that's is it Neil that just spoke? Yeah, I agree with him that actually happened very close to us in our farm, that there was land behind us, and there's a house there, and they're not doing anything with it, and it's empty. It's a beautiful house, but it's empty and nobody's using, and they're not. It's on land that could be sold because it's not being used. But anyway, I've lost the train of thought of what I was going to say. You did change my subject there for me.
Can we let Andrew in, Barbara, and then you
yes, of course,
back?
I'll come back if I remember.
Yeah, Andrew.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, can you hear you loud?
Okay, so I'm just working off my phone at the moment. Yeah, no, I am bothered, but I think there is, as we talked about before, with the carbon finance and the biodiversity finance, I think that does offer a new opportunity for communities to engage and get access to different kinds of finance that have never existed before. And I'm involved in, not so much in the UK, but internationally in some big two corporate-backed projects, one in Ghana and one in Brazil, where we're working with local communities and small farmers. And it does offer an opportunity to do stuff that just wasn't there 10 years ago. But what I think there is a shortage of is facilitators to make these big projects happen, kind of trusted intermediaries. And I've always wondered whether there's a greater role for councils, community councils or local authorities in Scotland to act as that facilitator, or to act as that to make these things happen. And a lot of the corporates I talk to are interested in with the rise of the thing called Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is pushing people away from offsetting, but to have more meaningful carbon reduction. But they're still interested in carbon, climate, and biodiversity. And what they're interested in is higher value investments, getting more outcome from that, and that communities are increasingly part of that, or increasing the value of having good community and great engagement is much higher than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. But so I think there is opportunities there, but I think it's that need for intermediaries and facilitators to assemble these projects, to pull all these elements together. I think that's what there's a shortage of, in my opinion.
Andrew, thanks. That's really helpful. It's good to have that wider experience. Penny, thanks for your bit in the text about the lessons from other countries. Yes, we absolutely, and we published some stuff you'll find on the website about what other countries do. No question that other countries do some pretty sensible things that we can learn from. All countries are different, so I think we're probably cautious about just jumping to conclusions, but no question that we can learn. Neil, I'm really sorry, but we're running out of time. I'm going to give David Stewart.
I'll just make one very brief point.
One quick point, yeah.
Very quick. You asked me what I'd want as a councillor. I just remembered now on Andrew's point, community councils can't own assets currently, so change the legislation to allow them to own assets.
Yes.
That's me. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, Neil. Thank you. So we've clocked that one, absolutely. At the moment, communities are doing great things, as Katie said, with the DTAS and development trusts and all the rest of it. Okay, I think I'm going to, David, I was going to let you in for last. Right, David Stewart, last word, because you've been very patient. David, last word on anything you want to say, then I'm going to wrap it up.
Just highlight briefly a couple of things. It's come up a couple of times about homes being underused or left empty. There is a consultation at the moment looking to allow councils to charge higher levels of council tax for empty homes or second homes. I've put a link in the chat. Another thing to highlight, there's been a bit of talk about community-led housing in urban areas. There's a report on town centre living we published, and we may well do further work in that again could help provide more homes and reduce carbon emissions. So that just a couple of things to flag very briefly.
David, thanks very much indeed. And I'll add another one, which is we recommended the government might consider compulsory sale orders where buildings are left vacant and derelict, so that you couldn't just sit on and allow to fall down a house. I mean, that cannot be in the public interest. It cannot be in society's interest for one person to be homeless while somebody else is letting a house fall down. And I could get quite annoyed about that, but I won't. Look, thank you, everybody. That's been a really good discussion, actually. You've kept me on my toes trying to keep things moving along, and we probably could have gone for another hour. Let me just close by saying that there is a huge amount. You know, I've been sort of involved in this sort of stuff off and on since the early 90s when I was involved in the Ascent Crofters buyout. It was one of the very first high-profile buyouts. It is extraordinary the progress that's been made through most of my professional lifetime, and I am really very, very optimistic. I think you've got a government that's committed to making progress. It'll make it responsibly, carefully. It's not going to run up against human rights legislation or do anything daft, but you've got a government that's committed to it, that's putting significant amounts of money into the land fund. You've got people, you know, like David Adams and David Stewart, who've got the brains to do the thinking, which I certainly haven't. And I think you've now got an organisation that you know, has the capacity to engage with the people of Scotland in all their diversity and the issues in all their diversity, and you know, we will not solve everything in a day. This is a multi-year process. I think. I don't think land reform is an event. Land reform is a process that goes on and on. But I'm immensely optimistic about it. So thank you for this evening. Very much enjoyed that, actually. If any of you in a village hall, you'd now come and speak to me behind the door where nobody could hear. If you want to speak to me, please use the info@landcommission.gov.sc and tell me you'd like to speak to me, and I'll give you a ring and talk to you privately. It's important that you have that opportunity. And not just, you know, if you want to say that was a load of rubbish and I want to hold you to account, fine. I'm happy with that too. I'm a public servant. But otherwise, please have a very safe journey to your kitchen or drinks cupboard or wherever you're off to. And thank you very, very much indeed for a very worthwhile evening. Good night to all. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very much.